Thanks for having me. Like Sergey said, I've been to NIMBioS a few times, and it's been great, so I'm really glad to be back. So as he said, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and like most evolutionary biologists, I care about trying to get explanations for how the diverse forms of life have evolved. And a lot of my work has been on building mathematical models for social evolution, and so looking really at how diverse social behaviors evolve. So the really sort of, kind of key component about social behaviors is they're often behaviors that allow individuals in a group to accomplish something that those individuals on their own couldn't accomplish. So whether you're thinking about ants forming a bridge across some kind of environmental obstacle, or a lot of complex human social behavior allows us to accomplish tasks that we couldn't do alone. And one of the sort of key, often another key component of those tasks is the fact that they're diverse tasks often. So while there's, we'll sort of see there's lots of theory that tells us about how social behavior evolves, certain kinds of social behavior, we have to sort of dig a little deeper to figure out how we get variation in that social behavior in or across populations. So you could think an example here, like this is a castell. It's a human tower that folks in Catalan make. They do it as sort of like a community building exercise. They compete across different villages or cities. And so it's very cooperative, but then individuals who are bigger and stronger are down at the bottom of the tower forming the base, and individuals who are smaller and lighter are at the top. So I'll talk about a couple different projects today, sort of two. The first is more focused on this question about when sort of the scenarios that you get polymorphism or some kind of diversity in social behavior in populations, and how that's a function of relatedness, of population structure, how it's a function of behavioral plasticity, and as well as sort of ecological synergies that might be in the population game itself. And then I'll move on to talk about a second project that's focused a little bit more on the kind of the psychology of cooperation and thinking about how we have whole sort of behaviors performed by whole populations, social norms, and how those norms not only evolve, but can evolve to be internalized by individuals in such a way that they don't have to be sort of punished by other individuals in the population, but they actually do some of that in punishing themselves. And if there's time permitting, a little bit of sort of like emerging, sort of not kind of nascent work, I should say, about kin selection and genomic variation. And so I talk a bit fast, so please interrupt if you have questions along the way. Get some acknowledgements out of the way, funding sources, and then my collaborator, Elar Akçay, who's on the second part of the talk. Okay, so synergy, sort of the evolution of sort of variation as a response, as a function of these different components, synergy and responsiveness and relatedness. So as you sort of know, natural selection, if we're going to use that as an evolutionary explanation for variation in populations, it can do two things. It can erode variation. So you can either get stabilizing selection, where there's sort of some kind of optimum phenotype where those individuals are producing more offspring than other individuals in the population. Or maybe there's directional selection where sort of the optimum is moving, sort of individuals are sort of constantly being selected to have higher and higher values of a certain trait. And so these could be due to sort of selective sweeps or some kind of purifying force. Maybe there's an optimal body size or temperature that individuals need to thermoregulate at. But then selection can also select for, if we're looking for understanding variation, it can also maintain variation instead of eroding it. And it can do this either by sort of disruptive or diversifying selection, where there's a sort of disparate or divergent phenotypes are being selected for, those individuals are reproducing maximally, or balancing selection, where some kind of intermediate regime of phenotypes are being selected for. So maybe there's heterozygote advantage is often a sort of an easily invoked mechanism for doing this. And anything that's sort of variable environments that might generate plastic phenotypes are often sort of a good example of something that generates, that selective selection might actually select for a variable set of types. So this actually occurs a lot in social behavior, I think, and there's sort of what the sort of aim of this part of the talk is to kind of show how these sort of four scenarios can emerge out of the sort of simple, sort of even the simple 2x2 kind of game setup that we would talk about when we talk about how social behavior might evolve, or talk about the sort of the components that are important. And so social behavior sort of as a good source for this, in part because it involves frequency-dependent selection. It involves the fact that because individuals, their fitness doesn't just depend on what they do, it depends on the behavior of other individuals in the population. So that generates this frequency dependence. And if that frequency dependence is positive, you can get where common types may be selected for, or types that have reached commonness because of positive selection, they're even more positively selected. If that selection depends on the environment in some way, or maybe even if it stochastically depends on the environment, then you can get variation, but that variation might be over sort of a range of environments where local populations are have the same type, but as the environment varies over those populations, you get a diversity of types. And so it's maintained sort of over large space and time. We can think of this as like coarse-grained diversity. And that might be in contrast to something like negative frequency dependence, which would generate more of a fine-scale level diversity. That diversity is within individual populations. So as types become, if they're rare, they have an advantage when rare, and they increase in frequency. And as they increase in frequency, they lose that advantage. So a bunch of types can be maintained. This, again, might be due to something like stabilizing selection or heterozygote advantage. So we'll actually be able to capture these 4 scenarios. We can sort of extract these from the 4 different sort of basic games of cooperation, and then see how those games change, and then make predictions about when we should get variation in social behavior and when we shouldn't. So to sort of give you the kind of rundown, you probably have seen, many folks have seen this kind of cartoon before, but I'll sort of walk through it still. So you have a social interaction between 2 individuals, say these 2 capuchin monkeys. They have an opportunity maybe to share some food resource with one another. They can cooperate if they share, and if they don't share, they don't cooperate. And there's basically, since there's only 2 of them and they can do different things, there's 4 outcomes. So they neither cooperate, they both cooperate. They both do the same thing, either cooperate or not, and which outcome they reach could depend on sort of a whole variety of circumstances. Or one of them cooperates and the other one doesn't. So there's a mixture. And these sort of correspond to those 4 examples. You get either sort of directional selection for cooperating or not cooperating, or you get kind of coarse scale variation where there's sort of a multi-stability of individuals. Some groups may be becoming cooperative and developing what you might even call a norm for cooperation, and others not. And that variation being maintained at a broad scale. And then in the final one, you get cooperation being maintained at a fine scale. So there's some balance of cooperation within that population, some individuals cooperating with others who are not. And so these 4 outcomes are actually captured by sort of the 4 games you might get from a sort of classic a 2-player game from evolutionary game theory. So you imagine again that there's some kind of payoff to being, if your partner cooperates with you, you get a benefit, you pay some cost if you're the cooperator, and if together you're cooperating, you get the difference of those 2 things. And as long as that difference is positive, then cooperation is beneficial. There's a potential, at least, for cooperation to be beneficial. So of course, in that simple case, everything's all additive. There's always an incentive to defect, and so you get kind of an evolutionary or Nash equilibrium, and that's no one cooperates, and that's the prisoner's dilemma. And what results then is that you have that's just directional selection for getting rid of cooperation from the population, no variation. You could imagine, though, that maybe cooperation isn't individually costly. Maybe there's some actual benefit to it. In that's the case, there's sort of no dilemma in the first place. Everyone cooperates. It's a mutualism. And you're sort of back to, again, directional selection, but in the opposite direction now for cooperation. So it could be then that maybe if there's still a cost to cooperation, there's a potential benefit from it. But if 2 individuals cooperate together, there's an extra synergistic component. And we can sort of measure that maybe with kind of an additional payoff component, D. So it's the sort of extra payoff that individuals get from cooperating together. It might be that they're involved in some kind of cooperative hunt, and they can take down a prey item that's much larger than the two of them individually if they cooperate, like lions in a hunt. So it may not be additive, and as long as that synergy is large enough, then you get now, in addition to having all defect become an equilibrium, you also get all cooperate becoming an equilibrium. And this corresponds exactly then to that scenario of a coordination game where individuals are, in some cases they can all coordinate on cooperate, other cases they can coordinate on not cooperating. And sometimes it just depends on the initial conditions. And so you might get some kind of variation across populations generated by this kind of process. And then finally, sort of returning to the case where there could be some direct benefit to cooperation, starting from like a mutualism, but it might be the case that as more individuals cooperate, it actually creates some kind of negative synergy. There's a decrease in payoff sort of per capita as you increase the number of individuals cooperating. So a really classic example of this is something called the producer Scrounger game. So if you are looking for resources, it's individually beneficial for you to spend the effort to find them if no one else knows where they are. But if there's other individuals in the population, once they know that you have knowledge of those resources, it's cheaper for them to just copy what you do. They're going to sort of scrounge that information. But if there's no producers, then a scrounger doesn't have anyone to scrounge from, and they're going to change strategy potentially and become a producer. So there's negative frequency dependence in that case. It produces a stable polymorphism, this mixed strategy. So you get that fine scale variation produced in this kind of case. Sometimes this is called a hawk-dove game. So there's 4 games, the sort of 4 kind of elementary games from sort of a 2-player evolutionary game, give you these outcomes, either sort of directional selection and no variation, or fine scale or coarse scale variation for the stag hunt and hawk-dove games. And so then what are the sort of circumstances that might change to lead you to one of these games or another? And what drives that is changing these sort of fitness costs and benefits of participating in these games. And there's sort of 2 main ways that that can occur. One way is by changing the demography of the population, and often we sort of invoke population structure in this case, thinking about how this kin selection effect of individuals who share some genetic relatedness with one another, that's going to create the potential for positive selection for cooperation. Or you could have behavioral factors. So individuals may be plastic in their behaviors, and they can reciprocate cooperation in real time for cooperation that they've received. And those factors might also make cooperation more likely. So we can see how changing those 2 factors alone and then together can create sort of the opportunity for either case of where we get some kind of variation in cooperation. So starting off with the demographic component, we're thinking about relatedness. So this sort of comes from looking at Hamilton's rule, which is sort of a kind of approximate way to look at the effect of selection in a structured population. And so the sort of kind of cartoon element of it is that you have some fitness cost, and then sort of you've maybe taken some complex model, you've linearized it, so you've eliminated kind of higher order effects of selection, and you can sort of gather things into some fitness cost added to a fitness benefit from the effects of behavior from other individuals in the population on yourself times how genetically related you are to them. And as long as those things sum up to something that's positive, there's positive selection for those behaviors that may be costly but generate this benefit. And so these benefits and costs then are actually, they're components of basically 2 things. They're components of those basic costs and benefits of that social game. So, literally how much resource I'm giving to my partner, how much that costs me in resources, and maybe those things translate in some relatively simple way to sort of fertility or fecundity, how many offspring you produce. And then this all gets sort of processed through demography. So these fitness effects then are part of that fecundity, but they're also in part affected by what's the strength of dispersal and how much competition is there where you land in a patch. And so what's sort of nice about taking sort of this kind of simplistic model is that because once you've sort of linearized everything, you can kind of rearrange terms, and it turns out you can sort of gather things where you've left these fecundity terms, the sort of benefits and costs from the game, you've left them kind of alone, and now you've collected everything, not just that includes relatedness, but everything that includes also some effects of competition because of this population structure. You've gathered them all in sort of a coefficient. It's kind of like relatedness, but it's scaled a little differently, and it's what those values are will depend a little bit on the demography. So you've kind of captured an index. You can sort of calculate this index then depending if you have an island model or a lattice model or some set of populations with variable population size. You could kind of crunch the numbers and come out with some kind of index that would tell you what that scaled relatedness is. Okay. So this just gives us, again, we can think about how does that select to tell us when cooperation happens. Really simple. If the benefits times this relatedness parameter are greater than the cost, you get mutualism. If they're less, you're back to the prisoner's dilemma, and there's no variation. So to get variation even in the simple case, you still need some kind of synergistic effect, some positive or negative synergy between the actions of the individuals in the population. So what you can do is you can actually take this payoff matrix we had before, which had synergy, and we can actually work through the model and sort of build a payoff matrix that now incorporates relatedness. So it's sort of similar to the one we had before, but now it has this relatedness component. And play that similar game of comparing if an individual's partner cooperates, which one is it beneficial for them to do, to cooperate or defect, depending on the values of the benefits, the costs, and the relatedness. And likewise, if their partner defects, should they cooperate or defect? So you can see how many of the different sort of the possible 4 games can emerge out of this matrix when you just change the relatedness, the benefits, the costs, and the synergy. So for the moment, we'll assume that cooperation is costly. There's an individual cost to it. So this illuminates, at least when there's no relatedness, the possibility that there's mutualism involved. And we can turn this matrix into a plot, basically. So on the x-axis is the strength of relatedness. On the y-axis is the strength of this synergy. There's negative values below 0 here, positive values above 0. And then here is whatever the cost of cooperating is. And so if you look at the case for no synergy, you're back to sort of the kind of normal Hamilton's rule case. If relatedness isn't strong enough, there's no cooperation, you're in a prisoner's dilemma. If relatedness is strong enough, you're back in a mutualism and there's a full cooperation. And then sort of in the catty-corner to those two things are, if there's enough positive synergy, you get a stag hunt, you get coordination, that coarse-grained variation, some groups cooperating, or some pairs cooperating, other pairs not. And then if there's enough negative synergy and enough relatedness, you get fine-scale variation, individuals taking turns potentially, some cooperating at one moment and then not cooperating at the next moment. And so what effectively happens here is you sort of imagine this increasing this relatedness drives up the total benefits to cooperation occurred to that trait because of the increase in relatedness, and then synergy is what drives it down into a Hawk-Dove game, that negative synergy, something like a producer Scrounger example. So then the second component, so relatedness isn't the only sort of, that's the demographic kind of population structure component. The other one is individuals can plastically respond to their partner's actions. And that often occurs when interactions are repeated. So individuals may, as long as they're living in groups that are persistent enough over time and they can observe and remember potentially the actions that their partners might have had, they'll be able to condition what they're doing on those past actions of their partners. So they can respond, and we often call this reciprocity or reciprocal altruism. And even in the simple prisoner's dilemma, if there's enough of this reciprocity or responsiveness, we can get cooperation going. So what we'll do is we'll measure that amount of reciprocity with a coefficient, sort of similar like we measure this effective relatedness with a coefficient. We're going to call it rho. And rho is it's sort of simply like if the partner cooperates, then how much that effort, you're going to reciprocate rho times that back. So if it were equal to 1, you were going to be perfectly reciprocal. If it's 0, you don't respond at all to what they do. You just do the thing you were doing before. And it could even be negative. You could even sort of retaliate. So that same, by building sort of a model of that, of what that behavior looks like, we can sort of build in this case, you can sort of build a Markov chain of how that process works. Look for sort of an equilibrium. If individuals would have a certain level of responsiveness, how much cooperation evolves in that model, and actually then convert it to this payoff matrix. And so you get, again, 4 entries of that payoff matrix, and you can do that same comparison again of when given a certain level of responsiveness, what kind of game do you get by just looking at, does it pay to cooperate or defect when your partner also cooperates or defects? So initially, when you do this, you get the same result from that we had from Hamilton's rule, because there's no synergy involved. So either if there's enough responsiveness, you get a mutualism. If there's not enough, you get a prisoner's dilemma and no cooperation. So we need to add synergy to it. And this is what the matrix looks like when we get that. And it actually generates visually something that looks quite similar to the effect we had with relatedness. Not sort of qualitatively the same pattern, but quantitatively it looks a little different. There are these regimes of the stag hunt and the Hawk-Dove are a little smaller, so there's sort of less kind of overall opportunity for variation evolving. There's the game types that lead to variation evolving. And it's a little bit easier in some sense actually to get this sort of mutualism outcome once you have enough responsiveness going. But the same sort of prediction that you have if there's no synergy, it's all prisoner's dilemma to mutualism. Enough positive synergy, And as long responsiveness isn't enough to make it mutualism, you have a stag hunt. And then there's a little bit of a small regime where you have that hawk dove, where you have this fine scale variation evolving. Yeah. It's a characteristic of it's an individual trait. Yes. I mean, at a ESS, it's a resident trait from, but yes, it's an individual trait. Relatedness would be, a fixed. I mean, it could be a function of dispersal rates. So it would be average of the population. But this yes would be an individual trait. It's a population trait only in the sense that it's monomorphic at the equilibrium. But yeah, the model doesn't include variation in rho at all. That makes it a whole lot more complicated. So you sort of, I don't know if you can, it's how to say it, that exact shape sort of arises out of these equations. I mean, that it has to sort of intersect here when there's no responsiveness. This is when you sort of get a coordination game normally. And then that this, at some point at B over C, that's the point where it has to turn in from prisoner's dilemma to mutualism. So then the exact shape of this depends a little bit on sort of like the particular behavioral model that I built essentially to include this responsiveness. So I think the details of this shape will differ depending on exactly how you do that. But I think qualitatively the pattern is going to be similar. There's less of a guide in some sense for like how to make a model that includes some kind of plastic behavior like that. And is both sort of simple and doesn't include too many details of a mechanism that might make it less sort of broadly applicable. Relatedness is a little bit easier. We sort of have a sense for like, we start off with an island model or a lattice model or something, and then we calculate this one quantity. For responsiveness, we don't quite have such a simple population model or genetic model, if you want, for how to do that. So I think there's maybe a little bit of more fuzziness around that, but I think the qualitative pattern is probably robust, yeah. Okay, so you can actually take those two things, and so we did those each separately and put them into the same model, combined model, where you now have a certain level of relatedness in the population, and individuals can respond to the levels of cooperation of their partner as well. And so I won't sort of show the payoff matrix for that. It's sort of bigger and more complicated than the previous ones. But again, you sort of start off with, say, for example, no responsiveness. This is now that graph we saw before as a function of relatedness and synergy. And you can increase the level of responsiveness, say, all the way up to, say, 0.5, and see how those different regions change. And sort of not surprisingly, the biggest pattern is that if you start including more relatedness and more responsiveness, two mechanisms which sort of can generate cooperation, you make most of this parameter space into a mutualism. And then what remains, unless those relatedness is too small, is the only thing that for generating variation is a hawk-dove game. If there's still enough negative synergy, you can still get this polymorphism in cooperation evolving in the population. So first, what's eliminated quickly is this possibility of a stag hunt, of getting this coarse scale variation in the population. So that was sort of one slice of this kind of like multi-dimensional parameter space. And so we can take the sort of analogous slice instead of having each of these plots being slices through different values of responsiveness. We can take and do slices for different values of relatedness. And get sort of qualitatively a similar picture where, again, you're getting mutualism once those two factors are high enough, and if synergy is strongly negative enough, you're getting a hawk-dove game. You're getting this polymorphism for cooperation in the population. Okay, so that sort of integrates those three different features, population structure with relatedness, behavioral plasticity with responsiveness, and these ecological synergies. And then as well, we can sort of expand it a little bit beyond just the two players in a group. So we might have groups of an arbitrary number of players. So social groups aren't just sort of pairs, but they're often more than just pairs. And The problem with this in terms of kind of analyzing often is once you start to get into looking at n individuals interacting in a group, it becomes very, very difficult to say anything generally. So what I'll sort of do is try to create a model for that sort of extends from that two-player case in sort of a simple way to n players. It sort of preserves, that just adds as little extra complexity about what could go on for n players, and see if we can sort of get some similar patterns emerging, and to maybe sort of extract then a little bit what sort of, is there kind of like a core effect of increasing group size if you're doing nothing else at all that increasing group size might, because it could add all kinds of other complexities, but what if it's just the effect of increasing group size? So we'll sort of try to match this pairwise interaction as much as possible. So so before we had just those two players, and so we could think we had our table, and basically it's just equivalent. It's kind of like making that table much longer. Now there's, if you're a cooperator or a defector, you have, and there's n individuals in the group, there's n-1 other individuals that could be doing different things, cooperating or not cooperating. So you just count up how many are cooperating, and then you can get there's a payoff. If you're all cooperating, we're gonna set that payoff to be the same as for the two-player game. And if there's no cooperation, everyone gets 0. If you're a cooperator and there's no one else cooperating, you're gonna get -c. So those sort of the corners are the same, and then sort of the what we do depend, like the question is how do we fill in that middle part. So what we'll assume at first is that there's an additive benefit. So each individual who cooperates adds b over n-1, which means that the total amount of additive cooperation b is constant in the population. Doesn't matter how big the group is. So this in some sense says that increasing group size can't sort of in some way increase that additive benefit at all. It's always capped at b. And as the group actually in fact gets bigger, each individual cooperator, as you add them, they add a smaller component, b over n-1. So it might, which sort of, I don't have like a good mapping, but certainly some ecological scenarios would map onto this kind of cooperation, others would map onto another. So we fix that total additive benefit. Again, the maximum amount of cooperation if everyone is cooperating is the same. And so that now, once we add each cooperator, there's gonna be some kind of synergistic component. And so I'm sort of borrowing from kind of like another way to parameterize these models that comes out with some nice analytical results for these n-player games. And it uses this kind of multiplicative synergy component. So I'm just going to turn, part of the kind of trick of this model is turning this d into this other parameter where the model has sort of some nice solution properties. But the upshot of it is that we can take our plot here for when we vary relatedness and synergy and change it then, in this case, for the number of individuals in the group, going from 2, 3, 5, and 10. And sort of remarkably, the pattern is very, very similar. So the same kind of threshold for relatedness, the same fact that above that synergy being positive, you get a stag hunt, synergy being negative with high enough relatedness, you get the hawk dove. And the main effect really is here. It means that in groups with very little population structure and little relatedness, a bigger group size makes it harder for cooperation to get off the ground. You need essentially higher and higher amounts of positive synergy to get that stag hunt, where there's at least some possibility of some of those groups cooperating. And that's really sort of the main effect once we sort of kept everything the same except for the group size. So you could, though, create a slightly different way to parameterize this n-player game, or this group of n individuals. So instead of saying that when you add each individual cooperator, instead of saying that they add b over n-1, which means that total additive benefit is capped, now they're just going to add b. So it's in some ways, the difference before we had a fixed total additive benefit, and this is now a fixed per capita added benefit. So for each individual, they always add b to the payoff. And so now there's still a synergy component. They're always adding b so here was, with 2 cooperators, you get b times the synergy. With 3 cooperators, you get another synergy component added on that synergy, then the synergy squared, and so on. Still the same kind of max cooperation if the whole group is cooperative as before. And so what that does then is, because now this additive benefit is essentially, there's more of it for larger groups. It means that as you increase group size, that parameter space for mutualism gets much, much larger. And we see a similar pattern that we saw before when we were increasing relatedness and increasing responsiveness, is that even though much of the parameter space became just everyone does cooperation, if synergy was still strongly enough negative, you still got a hawk dog game. You still got selection for fine scale variation in cooperation in the population. Okay, so that's sort of, there's other things that you could do with this. It's harder. I didn't include sort of a slice of this space with responsiveness, and in part because that model is much harder to solve when you add individuals in the population. The relatedness model, the one with relatedness, is a little bit easier because, as sort of Sergey was asking, it's a population quantity. Responsiveness is something that we start off, initially in the model, it's an individual level quantity, so if there's any variation in it, we'd have to account for all the possible individual states of the n individuals in the group, doing different levels of responsiveness and blah, blah, blah. So that's for further work. But so if we squint a little bit at the pattern that we see, it's mostly that if you want to look for variation, it's most likely at that fine scale within populations when there's some negative synergy, potentially when you have this constant benefit per capita, which means that, again, that those individuals, you can increase the amount of cooperation in the group by just increasing the group size. And if you need to add some relatedness and responsiveness in order for cooperation itself to sort of be selected for, and then for that negative synergy to then mean that some individuals should be doing cooperation and some individuals should be doing not cooperation. For that core scale variation, you need some kind of strong positive synergy like you might expect in some kind of cooperative hunt. And you don't want too much relatedness or responsiveness. That just makes cooperation in some sense, too likely to get off the ground. So to have this core scale variation, in some sense, it's for, we might expect it more in those cases where populations are less structured or genetic relatedness is not as much of a predicted component of the social structure in that population. Okay, so I think that's it for this part. So before I shift on, if anyone has any immediate things that they can think of. Yeah.
What would be examples of useful schemes?
So if you, if individuals, it depends on like how, maybe the elasticity. So if resources are involved, it's some kind of tragedy of the commons. If there's a lot of resource elasticity, individuals, as you add more individuals, they may generate more resources in the group. The resources may be sort of more productive per group member. Whereas if resources are less elastic, then there may be some fixed amount of resource. And it doesn't matter how big the group gets. So in that case, then individuals are sort of dividing up the same size pie into smaller and smaller pieces. So I think, yeah, you could come up with a couple sort of like how does the economy scale in effect for like a tragedy of the commons, and that will lead to these different outcomes. Yeah, just by sort of how simplified the model is that you're getting, you're either sort of getting a model where there's selection for this polymorphism or selection for multi-stability. So because there's only one dimension of behavior and it's do you cooperate or not. Yeah. So you could potentially add more complexity to it, right? You could add so the individuals could be, there could be phenotypes which allow them to sort of, maybe do a mixed strategy within a population, but the level of that could change, and then you might get core scale variation with some populations at one level, other populations at another level, but within each population, individuals are also doing different things, so, but that's not in the model. All right, so, the final upshot is that it's sort of like a lot of models of these types, the way that you sort of want to use it then is to generate comparative patterns and to sort of look at, can we find a set of, again, a comparative across kind of these economies of sort of different kinds of ecological economies that generate different social scenarios that where individuals have, different chances to get benefits from being in groups. And then see if then, based on how much population structure there is, how much potential for behavioral plasticity, do we get anything matching this kind of prediction. Okay, so the second part is it takes a little bit more of a kind of cognitive approach to looking at how cooperation evolves. So similar elements, but we're actually going to be looking at something kind of similar to that coordination game where we talked about the fact that individuals are all coordinating and doing the same thing, and that's often in economics and psychology, it's often called a social norm. And so we'll look at sort of how do these norms evolve and how are they sort of maintained, and potentially how are they sort of internalized into individuals where they don't need, or where some of the enforcement for them behaving according to the norm comes from them internally. And so I'll be sort of try to describe explicitly what I mean about that. So policing or punishment is something that's very common. This is just one example from social insects, from this Indian jumping ant, where in certainly this species and others, there's a possibility for individuals who aren't the queen to, if the queen dies, for individuals to take her spot. And so for workers who were before not being not reproducing, they can start reproducing. So they're physiologically capable of doing it, and what sometimes maintains them, prevents them from doing it is policing, is the fact that there are other workers in the colony actively, destroying the eggs that some of those workers who can reproduce are leaving behind. So workers, ants do this policing behavior. We do policing behavior. Sometimes we get very sophisticated about it. But in some sense, the upshot of it is that the behaviors that we're sort of policing can actually be, they can be complex, but they can also be very simple. So we can think of sort of a general kind of behavior that's expected in a population, where individuals sort of expect that other individuals are going to do that as a kind of norm. And individuals will expect that others do it. They might expect, they might themselves do it, and they also might expect that anyone who deviates from that, there could be consequences in the population for doing that. So one of the good things about this, like I mentioned, is that norms can coordinate. So if individuals are, say, in this cooperative hunting activity, where they can all not cooperatively hunt, or they can all cooperatively hunt. Cooperatively hunting is an equilibrium, but the question is kind of how do you get there? And so a norm, in some sense, can be a coordination mechanism for getting to one of these cooperative equilibria. So they can kind of enhance cooperation. So there's lots of examples of these norms. So people will say things like putting, which side of the plate do you put the fork and the knife, or which side of the road do you drive on? And that's a really good example, in part because those norms actually can change as well. So this was, in lots of parts of Europe, people drove on the left side of the road at one point. And so for some reason, I guess in Sweden, apparently they did that, but they also had a lot of cars that had also had the steering wheel on the left side, so they're sort of were the opposite of some countries, and so it made sense at a policy level perspective to change that norm to driving on the right side. And the way they had the government all got together, and there was a big ad campaign, and they coordinated it on this day, on 3rd of September in '67. There's a sort of right traffic day, and everyone moved over and drove on the right side of the road, and it was all no accidents or anything, or like maybe there's like one or something. It was, even accidents were down apparently for like 6 months after the event. So those kinds of norms, though, were often really important. Those expectations for what individuals do, and they often involve sort of very like economically or in terms of animals, reproductively important activities. So how much work within a social group or a family is distributed among different individuals. And so one mechanism that economists often use for studying norms is another kind of simple game. So this is kind of in the same kind of category of simple games like the prisoner's dilemma that we saw before. And it's called an ultimatum game. And the way that it goes is like this. So if you have two individuals, you declare one of them to be the dictator, and that individual gets a pot of money, and then that dictator's partner potentially can share some of that money, but the dictator gets to choose what the split is between those two individuals. And so the dictator could say, well, if it's $100, I'm going to keep 99 of it and you get 1, or maybe I take 50 and you get 50. And the only thing that the partner can do is the partner can thumbs up or thumbs down, yes or no, that split. If they thumbs up the split, then the split happens and they get that fraction of money the dictator said they could get. If they thumbs down the split, then no one gets anything. So if you're sort of just a strict game theorist and maybe a business school graduate, you would say, well, what you should do is the dictator should take not as much money as possible, leaving their partner as little as possible because their partner doesn't get anything if they reject an offer. So that gives them incentive to accept any offer. And if the dictator knows that, then the dictator is going to give them the least fair offer possible to maximize their payoff. So B School would say that's what you should do, but then you go out and measure it, and that's not what people do. So people, there are norms, potentially. So what part of the explanation is norms actually explain why people don't do the ultimatum game the way the game theory says that you should do it. So this is a pretty well-known paper from Joe Henrich about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, where he went and did this ultimatum game in a bunch of different populations across the world. And so what's plotted, this black line is the median offer from 0 to 100% in these different populations. And then the size of the circle is proportional to the fraction of individuals who rejected an offer of this percent. So almost many groups, people rejected 0 offers. Many groups also rejected 10% offers and 20% offers. And then even some groups rejected hyper-fair offers, rejected offers where they were getting more than 50% in the ultimatum game. So just to show, both of the consistent pattern was individuals were not, there was some norm potentially for fairness, and that there was also, there's lots of variation in it, and it was cross-cultural variation. So that there must be multiple factors sort of going into what exactly should be the norm. I don't know. Yeah, there are many. It was kind of an odd mixture. Emory freshman, Rural Missouri, Hadza, Chimane. Yeah. Do you know Sergey? Yeah. Okay. So the broader question we're trying to ask with this, so that's a bit of background. I mean, there's a little more coming. But is how do these cooperative norms evolve, and in particular, how do they evolve to be self-enforced? And so what we'll do is we'll build a model of cooperation and punishment where there's a potential for a norm, and we'll use something called a social preference, which I'll describe here in a second. And what I'll show is that this internalization can evolve, that norm psychology matters, so the sort of like mechanism of that preference matters, and that external punishment does actually help. It can help get the whole process going. So sort of anecdotally, you sort of know there's actually lots of evidence to show that punishment is important for enhancing and stabilizing cooperation. This is just some empirical data, so you can do lots of stuff in the lab. This is a well-known paper by some behavioral economists, and you have cases where there's not punishment in an experiment, and individuals increasingly contribute less and less to this public good. And in the second there's punishment, they immediately start contributing more and more. Individuals can pick whether they become part of a group that has some kind of institution for punishing, where they know that other individuals are going to punish them for not contributing. Some individuals will choose to be part of those groups and then contribute very highly. Others will choose not to be part and then contribute very lowly. So punishment definitely has a strong effect. And so sort of knowing that, the way that we're going to kind of think about the mechanism we're going to model sort of borrows from a little bit kind of both from economics and from a little bit from psychology, and it's something called a social preference. And so the basic idea is that lots of cognitive psychology has gone in to show about how there are special reward circuits in the brain that are important for learning, and those are like sort of for conditioning, basic operant conditioning, all the way through much more sort of complex learning processes. And so we can sort of imagine that you could, if you had a sort of utility function sort of from economics, that the amount of activation in that reward center is a little bit like a utility. You're getting sort of positive reward for doing sort of a behavior that you're trying to learn to do well, or as sort of they've gone to show in studies that different regions of the brain are actually important that are related to these reward centers, are very active when individuals are involved in cooperative acts, or involved in or sharing or something like that. So sort of a set of, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I sort of can't tell you a whole lot more about these brain regions, but a lot of prefrontal cortex areas tend to light up in these kinds of studies. And so it turns out also, it's not just sort of cooperation, but it's also the enforcement of cooperation, and even potentially sort of other kind of like more complex sort of feelings associated with that, like with guilt. So you can actually, people have some interesting experiments where they show, what do they do? They do this funny thing where they take like a photo of a starving baby, and they put it on, they say, like, will you donate $5? And then you can press yes, no. And if you press no, then it says, Jeffrey really needs this donation. He won't survive if you don't donate $5. And so then you can press yes, or you could press no, I guess. And then, so they can compare, they can say, well, they do one where you just press next, you can't actually make a decision. And they do one where you actually can press yes or no. And they measure the ones where individuals who press no then pressed yes. And they can say, well, maybe they were feeling some guilt or something like that. And so then, you can do the normal cognitive psychology thing and measure some fMRI. And anyway, so they tend to actually be in similar brain regions that are associated with learning and with social behavior. So maybe there's at least some kind of cognitive mechanism for this. So what we'll do is we'll try to create a model then of this social preference, of this utility function that measures kind of how much internal reward individuals are getting for doing a particular action in this, where they could potentially cooperate. And so what we'll have is we'll sort of be n individuals in a group. There's going to be some kind of level of contribution to cooperation, little a. Then there's what other individuals do, what other individuals contribute. There'll be the norm is going to be basically an opinion. So each individual will have an opinion about, what they actually contribute, and they'll have an opinion about what should be contributed. And the sort of mean opinion we'll assume to be the norm. So if they might be contributing, $10 to charity, but they really think individuals should be contributing $20, and maybe the mean is, 15 across a whole population. So the norm then would be 15, and maybe how much, and they deviate. If they say give 5 or something, they deviate 10 from the norm. In addition, we're going to assume that there's some kind of institution that could punish, and so that could be, and the individuals can contribute some costly contribution to that. So there's maybe a police force, or maybe they, sort of gang up together and observing other individuals in the population and, physically confront them or something like that. And so what we'll do is we'll have then some payoff. It's a function of all these things: how much they're contributing, how much the partners contribute, what the norm is in the population, and then what the level of punishment is for deviating. And it's going to be a function of there's going to be some benefit from that contribution level, a cost for whatever level that individual contributes, and then a cost from being externally punished by this punishment institution. And that's going to be basically a measure of it's going to be an increasing function of this difference. How much does that individual's contribution differ from the norm? So then we just say if it's a preference, then that's sort of the way that in economics you would sort of figure out what individuals do is they maximize their preferences, they maximize their utility, and so the preference function will choose just to say individuals just choose to maximize this particular payoff. And whatever they do is this behavior they do is this A star when that preference is maximized. And then the last part is to say that there's what's going to evolve in this game. So they get some kind of behavior based on whatever the norm is. That the two things that can evolve are sort of the levels of this norm, and then the level that they invest into punishing. And that, if the more they invest into punishing, the more that's costly to them, and that's something that's accounted for in their fitness. So if we sort of solve for a kind of like evolutionarily stable strategy in this kind of model, what we end up getting is once we have a little bit of relatedness in the population, so we need that to sort of get something to get cooperation going in the first place. Once we have a threshold level of that, then we get some punishment, external punishment evolving. So there's nothing internal yet. We get individuals contributing. This is their level of contribution to the good. And then the norm starts to evolve as well. And it actually, sort of this little dash line here that would be the norm that the population would have if the group were kind of as a whole producing maximum benefit. And so you never sort of get there in the long run. What happens is the norm gets closer and closer to that as the relatedness gets higher, and individuals actually start contributing closer to that efficient norm. And so in effect, what you kind of get is that as relatedness increases, you get more individuals are punished more harshly. The norm increases, or sort of the norm actually gets smaller, and their deviations from the norm get smaller as well. So they're sort of punished more harshly for even smaller deviations, and the intuition for that a little bit is that because relatedness is higher, effectively cooperation is cheaper. The incentive to cooperate is much higher, so cooperation is effectively cheaper. Okay, so that's just sort of how we get sort of external punishment going in it. Now we want to look at the internal part. So imagine there's some kind of psychological cost if you don't obey the norm. So maybe, you're Keanu Reeves and you feel really bad when you don't do good things for people, even though he's apparently a very good person and does all kinds of good things for people. So we can measure that and by incorporating it into this preference, this kind of psychological utility. And so we'll have a measure of this level of how internalized the norm is, something you can think of as like guilt. And it's going to be sort of tau. And what we'll do is we'll just add another component to your preference. So there's your payoff. And there's some internal punishment, which is stronger when there's higher tau. And it's just a function, again, of that difference between what you're doing, what you're contributing, and whatever the norm is. And again, your payoff is just your fitness is just your payoff minus whatever you contribute to this external punishment thing. So this internal punishment, this guilt, doesn't directly cause a fitness cost or benefit. And so what we do is it turns out the shape of this internal punishment is crucial. Whether or not it's as your deviation from the norm gets bigger and bigger, does that internal punishment accelerate? So you sort of get more and more guilty for every increasing unit of deviation you do. Or as you deviate, does it decelerate? So you still get more guilty, but you kind of get less guilty as you can per unit increase in your deviation. So if we have oh yeah.
Deviation from the norm is deviation from guilt, from the norm of guilt. So with the tau minus I.
So this is basically something like a function of a sub I minus alpha. So that's how much a sub I is what you contribute. Alpha is the norm. So your deviation from the norm is a sub I minus alpha.
So it's not the deviation of your guilt from the guilt of the average other thing.
No. This is just, that's right. It's just the material the deviation from the norm is like material. How much are you cooperating compared to the expectation level in the population? And your guilt then is a function of just that deviation. So yeah, so there's no, this is like an internal level of guilt, right? So this is like an individual quantity that, your individual experiences this level of guilt for not contributing to the norm. But this doesn't have a larger norm about guilt. The individual should feel guilty or something. That would be a even more complicated norm in a certain sense. Oh, so this is the tau sub I here? Oh, sorry. This is the average guilt in the group. Right. And that's in the sense of like doing an invasion analysis. So you just have to, that's what everyone else is doing. So that generates a certain level of contribution and generates a certain norm. So an invader's fitness is a function of those things. So it's also a function of the, because those individuals, their guilt level affects their actions, which affects how much cooperation an invader could take advantage of. Okay. So then what happens if we look at an accelerating guilt function, basically, we find that no matter how high relatedness gets, you can't get this parameter, this internal punishment parameter tau, you can't get a positive value of it to evolve. And sort of the intuition a bit for that is that because it's too costly, it's too difficult. If an individual can, one thing that changes in this model is that they can, what's also evolving is the level of that norm. So say an individual increases their expectation about when individuals should contribute to the public good. Then if everyone started doing that to say, well, I think maybe you should give a little bit more to charity, then then that actually creates an accelerating increase in how much guilt they feel, and that creates a corresponding increase in how much they contribute to the norm. So that, in effect, that's sort of too costly to get going on its own, and even with relatedness, you can't sort of evolve any of this internal punishment if internal punishment is effectively that strong. But it does work if the norm is decelerating. So at some point, there's kind of a trade-off. You'll only get so much cooperation out of feeling guilty about it because even more deviation won't get you substantially more guilt for that level of deviation. And so here you can actually get some positive amount of guilt evolving in that kind of population. And the sort of upshot, so that's just sort of these two results are both without external punishment. You can add then, and what if also there's some kind of external punishment force? Do those things work together to create even more guilt evolving? And the answer is, in general, yes. It depends a little bit on whether you have this accelerating or decelerating function. But in either case, once you have, so here's relatedness on the x-axis, and you have, this is the contribution level, so how much they're actually cooperating. Here's what the norm value is, what they expect individuals to be doing, and the expectation is always much higher. But what happens is with decelerating, it's a little bit more robust in the individuals. The norm's a little closer to what that actual level of contribution is, and the level of internal punishment is much higher when there's decelerating psychological costs to following the norm, or to deviating from the norm. Yeah.
What if it's accelerated?
I didn't try that. Well, I think yeah. So I didn't actually plot that. I don't. There were some. We had some analytical results to show that it had to be that you, in the case of accelerating, you couldn't get the existence of a stable equilibrium. So I don't know about the. Yeah, I didn't look at the actual knife edge case for when it's exactly linear. So it depended on the second derivative. So that's why we sort of looked at it being positive or negative. But yes, but good, good question. Look at this, the simple case. I sort of, in some ways, for a lot of these models, expect that it's good to, like concavity, these things will have a strong effect. So I sort of, but yes. I don't know if it's degenerate or if it's actually sort of just folds in. So I think, so the upshot is that these decelerating norm is sort of a little bit more robust because, again, you can't make individuals more and more guilty if they increasingly deviate from the norm. So just to sort of the upshot is we can sort of model these social preferences, these norms as social preferences, and we can, once we sort of solve this free rider problem, because we have, punishment is kind of analogous, there's sort of a larger story about how costly punishment is kind of like cooperation, so it needs a little bit of something to get it going. So once you have that something to get it going, like relatedness, you can get some of, not just external, but you can get internal punishment involving as well. And it tends to be decelerating. This internal punishment can evolve often when decelerating internal costs, and the accelerating one can evolve, but it's the only way it really can evolve is there's some other punishment institution externally that's also incentivizing individuals to contribute to the public good. So I think I'm about at time, so I'll skip the sort of second part, which you can ask me about later, and I'll just say that I'm hiring postdocs and grad students, and I'll take any questions.
So what do the cognitive folks, when you've talked about this to cognitive folks, what do they say? Do they say, oh, we can do a new experiment to evaluate this? Or do they say, how the heck do we?
I haven't had enough of those conversations, but at this model in particular, with sort of social, the idea of using social preferences, I think it hasn't been incorporated too much into the empirical work, but so the answer is I don't know, because I haven't had really good conversations with the kind of social psych folks who would do these fMRI experiments, but the kind of motivation for doing it was, in part, it's kind of a relatively natural combination between what behavioral economists do and what sort of folks in social psych are doing. And so my guess would be they should be sort of relatively open to it, because you can sort of build, you would just change the experiment just a little bit and then look at, how much, as a function, and say, for example, of how fast does that reward increase per unit, of like donation that they do in the experiment. They could actually get at things like the concavity of some function potentially. So I don't see it as actually being that far off. I mean, as long as you're willing to sort of believe results that come out of experiments like that in the first place. I think there's.
Yeah, I know.
So.
Oh, hi. I was really fascinated by the idea how we can model the social behavior. And yeah, it was really awesome. Yeah. My question is that how would you identify each variables for like the penalty and punishment and coordination? Is there any specific way we can quantify them?
I think it depends a bit on they're easiest to identify maybe in kind of an experimental setup. So you could set up an experimental game where you have explicitly defined the payoff and the punishment for deviating from some kind of norm or expectation of a certain level of cooperation. To find it, say like in an animal social system, that I think is quite a bit trickier. Yeah, and so that I have a lot less of a kind of roadmap for, and I think in part the field has less of a roadmap for it. So even the sort of studies that would, I think there will be more work that's sort of going in that direction, but even the studies that sort of look for what might be sort of more sophisticated kind of social responses and things like even like going not just to primates, but going to other mammal species, that's I think a little bit more controversial. You know, so some people will say, well, we can find empathy or we can find these kinds of reciprocal behaviors, but then it's not even agreed on in, among empiricists exactly what they've identified. So I think there will be more work in that direction, but I don't have a good roadmap for it, and I think in part because empiricists are still working hard on identifying those things in animal systems. In humans, it's a lot easier. You just set up an experiment.
I'm a psychologist, so I'm out of my depth a little bit. But so one thing that struck me is that you have social norms and then you have individual preferences, right? And I mean, I understand you treat them separately,
right?
And then the gap is the guilt, let's say.
Right.
But when they report their individual preferences, it's as if it's independent from this. Do you know what I mean? The number you get for individual preference, you're treating that as independent from the number you get for their social norm. But when they report their individual preference, it's probably, the social norm is probably already baked in.
Yeah, so this, I guess in a way, this does, I mean, their preference is a function of whatever that norm is. So here's their opinion about the norm, and here's sort of average opinion of other individuals in their group about the norm. And that's baked into their payoff, because that determines how much they're deviate. The norm is affecting how much they contribute. It's affecting how much other individuals are contributing. So that affects their benefit. If we go back, so their contribution is here. So they contribute a sub I, and that to some benefit to the public good. Everyone else in the group contributes on average a minus I. Then they get a cost for their contribution, and then in that simple case, then there's some punishment that they get, this external punishment. So they all sort of do factor in their utility. Their preference is a function of all of those things, right? But it is a separate. It's true. It is a separate in this model. There's an opinion about the norm, and then there's what they actually contribute, and those things are different. And it's in some ways a crucial part of the model. It doesn't really work if we assume they're the same.
Before, but it's about terminology. Is it really a norm you're talking about? So to me, it looks you're talking about conformity. So basically, what individuals are punished is the deviation from the average. That's basically conformity. And conformity. Again, I'm not a psychologist, Gary. You will correct me, but conformity can come from many different reasons. So you want to belong, you want to feel good about yourself, and
right?
Stuff like that. And is it really guilt? Gary, is it about guilt?
Some people say it's about guilt, yes.
For example, I know, like if it's shame, it's about your status, I guess, when you do something that's wrong.
Right.
All right. So here it's not that.
That's right.
If I want to, so I'm kind of.
I don't know if I could. If I could parse those things really finely. I think that the sense that we wanted to start out with something that was like relatively simple in terms of to start with a preference approach. But yeah, there's definitely parts I think of kind of a guilt mechanism that it doesn't capture for sure. But I think there's an element of it where guilt is some kind of internal cost that some individual is paying in their own utility. So that's in that sense I think it captures a part of guilt at least.
Hi. So I would have thought that a big benefit of guilt is that an internal cost like that would prevent you from incurring what would be ostensibly a much higher concrete cost of external punishment.
Right.
But you've talked a lot about the cost of guilt, like with the accelerating, the exponential function of, like guilt doesn't evolve in those scenarios because the cost becomes too high. Could you provide some examples of what a cost of guilt would be?
So that is just the cost of, so if it, so it just, the cost there and just being that, the fact that you, here, once this gets very, very high, so that's just saying that this thing's accelerating too fast. So what that means is then that that's, because you're trying to maximize your preference, you're going to be choosing contribution levels to counteract that increasing level of cost, that internal cost, that guilt. You're going to be increasingly adding this contribution level in such a way that it's because of the benefits are decelerating and the costs, the actual payoff costs are accelerating, so you're going to be contributing way too much to it. And that's there won't be selection for that level of contribution to the public good. So that's, the cost is sort of internal here, but it's made because what it makes you do is increase your contribution, and that costs you because of this eventual personal cost of the contribution.
Why would internal punishment like guilt be more effective in causing you to contribute more and more than an external punishment?
Well, it's more that it's unstable actually in some ways. I mean, external punishment does have that same effect. If they're both accelerating, then yes, like the same increase in external punishment could result in the same, as internal punishment could result in the same increase in your contribution level. But the external punishment, it's in part because of the way that we modeled it, because we have, because here it's just a fitness cost. It's something you can't escape. If you pay it, the internal punishment, there's that tau. If you have no tau, then you pay no guilt, and you don't do anything. And if there's some cost for punishing, and you punish it all, you're always going to pay that cost for punishing. So it's a bit the way that the external punishment is a direct effect on your fitness. The internal punishment, it doesn't change fitness directly, and that's important. So it's actually in some ways a weaker mechanism because of that. External punishment in some ways is a stronger mechanism.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I am wondering about the way you've characterized the cooperate versus don't cooperate dilemma. It strikes me as a little bit artificial, because what seems to be the right way to think of it, of decisions, or not, but behavior in some contexts, as either contributing to project one or contributing to project two. And then it seems like maybe the dynamic is going to be very different when it's really an opportunity when not cooperating with project one. The cost of that is an opportunity cost of not cooperating with project two. So I don't know if you've thought about this question.
Yeah, so most of these, they have it's a very sort of cartoonish, in some sense, way of breaking of sort of what that state space is, of what the possible sort of actions are for individuals, and then effectively what the sort of complexity of the social game they play is really the simplest here in some sense. So yes, it's like, I think, so it's to get a sort of intuition for those more complex scenarios. It's not so much a model or it's not so much to sort of claim or not claim what can or can't happen in those more complex scenarios. One thing you can do, you can sort of make, you can make the state space continuous. So you can say there's a continuum of different levels of contribution, and I think that allows for a little bit more, like in the sort of the second model, a little bit more richness to the model. And then the thing that's just harder is to add variation in the population. There's multiple individuals in the population can do multiple different things, or some groups can do one thing, other groups can do another thing, and that just makes the analysis harder. So it's not interesting, or it's just something I've worked a little bit less on because of it's difficult to get sort of simple answers from it. So
this was great.
One last. Yeah, really good talk. I was gonna ask, you didn't show any results for group size in the last.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it as much, so yeah, I actually don't have a good sense for how group size affects it. I don't think it doesn't have there would be some clear effects sort of from the first part of the talk if group size has effects on sort of the total amount of benefit available to the group, then it's going to have sort of similar effects here, where if it just makes cooperation easier, and so it might be easier to get internal punishment or even external punishment off the ground. But yeah, I don't know. We haven't looked at sort of the effect of group specifically on, trying to control for its effect just on cooperation, but for its effect on that preference. Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that.